Hello and welcome to the Lebanese Politics Podcast. My name is Benjamin Red, joined as always by Nizar Hassan. Nizar, how are you doing?
It's good. I'm good. It's good to be back.
Yeah. Sorry to everybody for our extended absence, but we are back in the saddle now. And this is actually a very special episode that we have because we realize, the Lebanese Politics Podcast. But this week we've got a guest and we're going to be talking about Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason to make any excuses or explain why we want to talk about Palestine because it's very important not only for Lebanon but for the whole region and maybe the whole world as a conflict, especially what was happening in the last few weeks. And we're very happy to have with us Laura Al-Bast, who's a Palestinian journalist and organizer in diaspora in Washington, D.C. Laura, can you tell us about yourself?
Of course, thank you so much, Nizar and Ben, for having me. So I work at the Institute for Palestine Studies in DC. We have an office in Beirut and Ramallah as well. And I organize with the Palestinian Youth Movement in DC. We've been organizing a lot of the protests happening across North America, including one of the largest foreign policy related protests in DC on Palestine on Nakba Day. I'm really happy to be here with you, and especially to talk to the Lebanese community. My grandmother was a Palestinian refugee in Saida, and I went to AUB for my bachelor's, so it's really great to be here.
All right. Well, we're super excited to have you as well. Very quickly, we are going to go through sort of an abbreviated version of the Lebanon news this week, so that we can get quickly to our main topic today. So let's just run through this, Nizar.
Yeah.
First off, COVID report. We're actually doing good. Good news for once, or at least not bad news in this area. So we've seen the case numbers drop dramatically since the last time we came to you, sort of like low hundreds testing positive each day. ICU numbers are down to about 250 or a little bit below today when we're recording this on Saturday. Deaths are down significantly as well, down to the single digits, at least on some days, which is good.
Yeah.
Now the question, of course, is what happens when we're opening back up? And this is a sort of a tricky thing. Are people going to become complacent now? What's going to happen, especially with sort of the low vaccination rates? There have only been about 660,000 vaccines administered so far, and just about 220,000 people fully vaccinated in the country. So that is still a big, big concern. But overall picture, finally a little bit of good news, but don't get complacent, right?
Yeah, exactly. But like it's for once now, Corona is not the main thing happening in Lebanon anymore.
Exactly. We might have to stop putting it at the very top of the podcast at some point.
Yeah.
Let's hope. Let's hope for that.
All right. Coming back to real Lebanese news, we have a new scandal. This time, it's the foreign minister in the resigned government, Charbel Wehbi, who was on a talk show with a Saudi political analyst, Salman al-Ansari, and he made, after some heated exchanges in the debate, he made comments about Ansari being someone from a Bedouin background, implying that he's from an inferior cultural background, and he blamed Gulf countries for the rise of extremist groups in the region. So this discourse is not usually something that you hear from a foreign minister in Lebanon, and it had a huge backlash from the Saudis, but mostly from the Lebanese political establishment. The next day was really like surreal. Every major politician almost representing a political party or movement that is not an enemy of Saudi Arabia was visiting the Saudi ambassador in Beirut. People like, the heads of religious authorities as well as major politicians and across the spectrum.
And Wehbi, who is President Aoun's guy, Gibran Basil's guy, right, with the FBM. I mean, the president immediately disavowed what he said, oh no, he was speaking in a personal capacity. He resigned the very next day. And I mean, this is deeply, deeply embarrassing to the FPM. First off, this is a senior politician who's supposed to be a diplomat saying this stuff using, racist terminology and stuff. And then also to Gibran Basil, I think specifically, with his presidential ambitions. If you want to become president in Lebanon, it helps if you have Saudi Arabia on board. It helps if you have like all of the regional powers on board. And if this is the kind of person that Gibran Basil likes to appoint to high positions, are the Saudis really going to trust him? I mean, the relationship was never good, right?
Yeah.
But this is a big setback as well. for him.
And the number of visits the next day to the Saudi ambassador just shows and reminds us that Saudi Arabia actually has leverage in Lebanon and يعني hasn't yet become like an irrelevant player. Otherwise, you wouldn't see all of these very, top level politicians going there.
And so now we have a new acting caretaker foreign minister, Zaina Akar, who is the caretaker defense minister as well as deputy prime minister. So now she's got a third role to take on within this, resigned cabinet. And speaking of a resigned cabinet, when will the next cabinet actually be formed? Well, as of today, that we are recording this on Saturday, May the 22nd, it's been 7 months exactly since Saad Hariri was designated to form government. We're still nowhere close to that actually happening, but there was some movement this week, sort of a spat between the Aoun camp and the Hariri camp yet again. And I find the timing of this actually a little bit interesting because it was right after Wehbi, this whole scandal happened. That happened Monday night and then Tuesday afternoon, President Aoun sent a message to Parliament, an official letter saying Hariri has been unable to form a government. I'd like you guys to meet and talk about this. And so Parliament convened on Friday, read the letter, put off discussion until today, Saturday. They met again, and it was really just sort of a lackluster session, about an hour and a half long. You had speeches from various people, mostly, it led up to Basil's speech. Basil is also an MP from Batroun. His speech, which lasted, almost half an hour, and followed by Hariri responding, and Hariri's speech was almost as long as Basil. So it was, but also within all of these speeches, nobody really said anything new. It was really just the same sort of accusations we've seen going back and forth, or you're causing the obstruction. No, you are. We just want this, this. And at the end of the day, what happened? Parliament affirmed Hariri as the prime minister designate, affirmed that he needs to form a government with the agreement of the president in line with the Constitution. So, really, it was much ado about nothing.
It's literally nothing new. Just some theatrics.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is at the level of, the political institution, the parliament and the cabinet. On the ground, we saw some interesting developments in the last week or a couple of weeks. We'll talk about the Palestine solidarity events that happened and marches later in the discussion. And one of those things is that we had the expat vote for the Syrian presidential elections. And as usual, there was mobilization among Syrian refugees in Lebanon, especially in support of Bashar al-Assad, convoys and all of that going to the stations to vote. And
allegations of coercion amongst people who didn't want to go, etc.
Yeah, it's much more nuanced than it seems. Usually Syrian intelligence is involved. Local actors allied with the Syrian regime are also involved in pressurizing these refugees to get on the bus and go to that destination to vote for Bashar al-Assad. So it's not like any organic event at all. But this year, it provoked some people, especially from the Lebanese forces background. And we had a few dozens of Lebanese forces youth go down to the streets and trying to block the buses, in some cases attacking some of the cars and convoys. So it was quite an intense scene. And the interesting thing about it is that, on one hand, it was self-evident that, they are exercising a democratic rights as Syrian citizens trying to, advocate for a certain political leader. On the other hand, this person is considered a war criminal by a lot of people in Lebanon, and is very provocative at this point to kind of renew allegiance to Bashar al-Assad with everything that's happening, and people investigative journalists linking the port explosion to the Syrian regime, and all of the new developments that have kind of renewed the anger against the Syrian regime. But obviously the violence should have been, kind of a filter, and you would expect people to say no, no to this violence. And the reality was that there was a lot of polarization about it. Christian parties mostly not stood behind the LF people, but kind of, justified it in a way by saying, no, the Syrian voters were too provocative in their actions by chanting things for Bashar al-Assad and all of that, and they shouldn't be allowed to be doing this in Lebanon. Many people like, Jumana Haddad, the feminist figure who created a human rights center under her own name, made a statement about how they should go back to their country and to be able to exercise this right. So it was a very interesting, polarizing moment. And parties like Kata'ib, which have been kind of resituating themselves in the opposition, were also very hesitant to condemn or say anything against the violence that happened.
Yeah, I could talk about this for probably 10 minutes by itself. I won't do that though, because we want to move on. Suffice it to say though, like for a lot of these parties, they're sort of placed between, if they want to be popular, they have to say one thing. If they want to actually lead on the issue, if they want to actually, stand up for freedom of expression or whatever, it's kind of tricky to do for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that was quite informative. And with that, I'll wrap up so that we can actually move to our big topic this week, which is Palestine, what has been going on there over the past few weeks. And Laura, you're going to be able to hopefully sort of walk us through some of this stuff, what's been happening, the causes behind it, and perhaps what we can expect out of all of this.
Especially that Laura was actually one of the early online organizers around Sheikh Jarrah, so one of the first people or early people to be launching this online campaign, which got a lot of traction worldwide. So yeah, Laura, tell us how things happened, how things developed in the early moments, which most of us don't know about.
Of course. So I actually met Muhammad al-Kurd, if folks know him. He's a resident of Sheikh Jarrah. His family is one of the 4 families under threat of forced expulsion from their homes in Jerusalem. I met him end of March. I was interviewing him for an article, and I realized that no one is talking about this. How can I help you? And I got in touch with some organizations in Palestine, like the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, and organizations in the U.S. who were trying to work around writing and sending a petition to the State Department to demand an end to the expulsion. Now, this didn't start in March. This started in 1972. Muhammad, when he was 11 years old in 2009, was talking about his family's expulsion the same way he's talking about it now at 22, 23. What occurred is after families were forced out of their homes in the Nakba in 1948, they were resettled on Palestinian land in Jerusalem, which was administered by the Jordanian government. They were given homes by the UNRWA. They were given ownership documents after 3 years of being on the land by the Jordanian government. And then 1967 happened, the Nakba War. Jordan no longer had jurisdiction. And that's when Israeli settler organizations began mobilizing and saying, hey, we want this land. It belongs to the Jewish people. It started in 1972. They kicked out more than 43 Palestinians from their homes in 2002. They kicked more Palestinians in 2008. In 2009, settler organizations took over half of Muhammad al-Kurd's house, burning the crib of his baby sister, throwing a TV at his grandmother, who had to go to the hospital, and she passed away recently, Allah yarhamha, and took over half his house. And since then, these settler organizations have been constantly suing these families, who are more than 550 residents in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, in Israeli courts, who legally have no jurisdiction over what the international community calls East Jerusalem. So from one hand, the court has no jurisdiction, has no right to give an opinion or a ruling. And from the other hand, nobody's actually defending these families. They're having to do it by themselves. They're calling the media by themselves. They're going to the streets by themselves. They're organizing by themselves. Now, why does the world know about this right now? Because on May 2nd, there was a hearing in the Supreme Court, the Israeli Supreme Court. It was an appeal that the families had submitted because their appeal in the Jerusalem court was rejected. So they went to the Supreme Court, said, hey, here are documents that prove that we live here. People went to the Ottoman archives and dug up documents showing Palestinian ownership. The Jordanian government, even though they were super, super late, eventually provided copies of ownership documents as well. The Supreme Court did not want to look at these. And what they did instead, they took documents from the Israeli settler organizations without verification and just took them, oh, this is fact, that's it. Now, because of the online campaign, because people were mobilizing, sharing the hashtag Save Sheikh Jarrah, Anqidhu Hayy Sheikh Jarrah, people were in Clubhouse with hundreds and hundreds of people just talking about Sheikh Jarrah, Twitter, Facebook, etc., etc., etc. There was media attention. So because of the media attention, the Supreme Court decided, okay, I'm not going to make a ruling right now. I'm going to give you until May 6th to figure out an agreement with the settler organizations. The settler organization's proposal was you pay rent to us, and when your head of household passes away, we might, sue you again and take over your home. Obviously, the families rejected that, and then they postponed the ruling again to May 10. Now, why was that significant? That was significant because on May 10, settler groups and far-right groups in Israel called for a march on the route towards Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, let's keep in mind, we were still in Ramadan. There were worshippers every day at Al-Aqsa. People were fasting. The families were being harassed while they were fasting as well. It is a holy month. So they called for a march and called for a death to Arabs, as usual. We've seen this reported on at end of April when they had a different march in Jerusalem. And this is not the first time they chant death to Arabs or have these kinds of marches. If you go to the Institute for Palestine Studies chronology articles, you can see that in 1986, in 1996, in 2006, in 2012, there are so many instances of just hatred towards Palestinians who are just living in their homes trying to survive. So when that happened, the court decided, and Netanyahu and Gantz actually, they interfered and decided, okay, we are going to postpone the ruling for 30 days because of the quote-unquote tensions taking place in the city. Now, that's when everything everything that you see right now took place. Soldiers attacked worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque. They blocked far-right groups from entering so that they can attack the worshippers. We've seen grenades being thrown inside the mosque. We've seen grenades being thrown at medics. More than 600 people were injured. The difference this time was that we weren't just watching this happen on Al Jazeera or, I don't know, other cable networks. We saw this live on Instagram of Palestinians who are at the mosque, of Palestinians who are in Sheikh Jarrah, filming the moment that they are beaten, filming the moment that they are arrested, filming the moment that they are blinded by rubber bullets. So that had a very significant effect on how the online and offline campaigns exploded. We have never before seen up close first-hand witness accounts of how Israel treats Palestinians. It felt like we were there in some moments. And what occurred as well was that the families in Sheikh Jarrah told Palestinians in the diaspora, Arabs in the diaspora, allies in the diaspora, the fight is online. You need to amplify our voices. You need to share the videos that we are giving you. No one is reporting about this. The only way the world will know about the attacks at Al-Aqsa, about the assaults in Sheikh Jarrah, is if you show it to them. So that took place. We've all seen that happened, and people continuously demanded help. Please help us. They're forcing us out of our homes. Please help us. They're attacking us in the mosque. Nobody said anything. There was no media attention, international media attention on this. There were no statements by world leaders on this. The statements that came out were after bombings went off in Gaza. Israel, as usual, took this as a PR opportunity to say, oh, look, we are being attacked by terrorists. Look, we're being attacked by terrorists. Help us, help us. And everybody rushed to their aid. We stand with Israel, with Israel's right to self-defense. We've seen a statement by Ned Price, spokesperson of the State Department in D.C., being asked multiple times by an AP journalist and by an Al-Quds News journalist, do you condemn the killing of children? Do you condemn the killing of children? And he would not do that. And he would not admit that Palestinians have a right to self-defense. And he would say that any state has a right to self-defense, which is very surprising to me because the U.S. always talks about state violence during the Arab Spring, whether it was Egypt or Syria. So why are they now making a differentiation? When has state violence ever been acceptable against civilians, knowing that Israel is an occupying state for 73 years? A lot of journalists who speak to Palestinians in America always, and you can see it on CNN, they always say, oh, please don't take us back decades and decades ago, just tell us what happened. Well, no, I'm going to take you back decades and decades ago because this never stopped. When more than 700,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes in 1948, they became refugees, and the killings, the beatings, the lynching, the expulsion in their homes in Haifa, Lod, and in the West Bank, settlement expansions in Gaza, the siege for 15 years, that never stopped. But people weren't talking about it. I hope that gives you sort of a brief of why we saw what the news media is calling a flare-up when it is really an attack, a targeted attack on Palestinians in Gaza because of what's happening in Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah. As of today, more than 240 civilians have died in Gaza. They are still finding bodies under the rubble, and that included 66 children. 14-year-old Lina Isa, 1-year-old Muhammad Al-Attar, 11-year-old Ibrahim Al-Masri was playing on his bike during Eid after taking money from his father and being so happy about it. And I was on I'm sorry if I'm taking so much time, but I was on a interview with a radio station in DC. The interviewer was extremely aggressive, as usual. They bring on people just to ask them what they think about terrorism and if they support violence. And he had previously hosted an IOF spokesperson, an Israeli military spokesperson, who explained to listeners that, oh, it's okay. We do something called knocking on the roof, where we alert them that we are going to bomb them. So we give them 5 minutes to leave the house. And I had to explain to the journalist how absurd that sounds, that if I heard a small rocket warning on my roof, as an adult, I would be horrified, scrambling to figure out what to do. How can I leave? How can I survive? Imagine how that is for children. For Ibrahim Al-Masri and his brother, they weren't in a building. They were in the middle of the street. Israel not only lies and kills, they try to justify the murder of children. How horrible is that?
And everybody, as you say, is seeing this sort of like in real time, on Instagram, on social media somewhere. And it's really strange to me, to see the juxtaposition of images coming out, a lot of them from Gaza, but also from the Al-Aqsa compound and from, towns like Lid. You see all of that, these horrifying videos, and then you look and see, you mentioned, Ned Price, that sort of infamous press dealing that he had. I read the readout of that, and it really is just very striking about how, when he's asked to condemn these images that everyone is seeing, he's unable to do that. And he falls back to this line, Israel's right to defend itself, which, I mean, really, at least to me, just wears thinner and thinner every time they use it, especially given what we can see with our own two eyes on social media of what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, and let's talk about the impact of what's happening in just a bit, because obviously this was different from wars we've seen before or conflicts we've seen before in terms of international solidarity, how Western liberals look at it, a lot of things. Let's talk about it in a second. But what's fascinating about this moment is not only that there was a conflict and people took positions, it's that there was some sort of uprising, like a serious nationwide uprising in historic Palestine, including inside 48 in the West Bank, and there was very different tools of resistance being used. In some areas there was mostly non-violent resistance with some rocks being thrown, etc. In other areas there was like serious confrontations between young men, for example in Lid, and very militarized police presence, Israeli police presence and Israeli army troops. In Gaza, obviously being completely disconnected from the rest of Palestine, the only resistance tool was rockets, which were fired in extensive numbers, and also in a way that kind of broke through the Iron Dome, the Israeli anti-rocket missile defense system. So I want to talk about this uprising itself, as a social phenomenon in Palestine, and putting it in the context of what has been happening in Palestine in the last, decade or so, in the regional context of many Arab states normalizing relations with Israel. I'm just going to ask you, Laura, you as a member of Palestinian diaspora, someone who's committed to this, to Palestinian liberation cause, What's special about this moment specifically to you?
You know, Nizar, this feels different. Any Palestinian you ask that has been on this for the past few weeks, they tell you something is different. Like, we actually feel that liberation is near. And I hope it is. The difference in this uprising is, and what people are calling it a unity intifada, is that Palestinians from all walks of life, from every city in all of Palestine, have united together to push the same campaigns, the same protests in solidarity with people, whether it was people in Nablus standing up with people in Haifa standing up with people in Jerusalem, or people in Jerusalem standing up with people in Gaza. It is different. It is different. And I think we do owe it a little bit to the social media attention that has been pushed in collaboration with people in Palestine. There are groups in Haifa who created a drive where they put footage of everything that has been happening to them, the marking of doors to differentiate who is a Palestinian living in this apartment and who isn't. And then 3 hours later, Israeli police barge in and start beating the Palestinians. I let the analogy speak for itself. I'm not going to even say what that looks like. Footage of a grenade being thrown at the face of a Palestinian in Akka, just standing by his motorcycle, not doing anything. This hasn't been shown online. But what has been done is that Palestinians in Haifa, as an example, put this footage in a drive, contacted Palestinians in the diaspora and said, hey, push this out. They are killing us. Palestinians in the diaspora took it upon themselves, with their large followings, with their networks, with their connections, with the institutions that are already built abroad for Palestine, and they started pushing out. Look what they are doing to us. The amount of online chatter around Palestine was so big, it was impossible for people to ignore. It was impossible for people to ignore. We began having not only media personnel, but regular Americans just talk about Israel and Palestine in the street. I have never heard that before. Walking down the street, hearing someone talk about Jerusalem. I've never happened to me before. I'm always wary about even saying the word Palestine because of some discrimination I have faced when I moved to America. So that is different. It is different. People are talking about us. They're realizing that they are no longer believing Israeli talking points, to the extent that there was so much backlash towards the New York Times that today they published an article that talks about the reality of the occupation. That never happens. We're always yelling at the New York Times to stop acting as a PR tool for the Israeli government. So I am extremely hopeful. I'm extremely hopeful. At the same time, I'm a little bit worried because of the ceasefire that has been announced, I believe 2 days ago. You know, we keep telling people this ceasefire means nothing. Historically, every time a ceasefire has been called between Israel and Gaza, Israel has continuously violated their ceasefire. In my personal opinion, this is a ceasefire for the media to stop reporting about this, for politicians to stop talking about this. And we saw a day later, after the ceasefire was announced, soldiers went in and started attacking worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque again. Sheikh Jarrah is still surrounded by barricades and soldiers who are IDing them, who are beating them, who are attacking them. Last week, we saw a soldier shoot a rubber bullet at Jana Al-Kiswani, who's a 15-year-old resident of Sheikh Jarrah, who now has a broken spine and bruised lungs, and inshallah, not paralyzed. I really hope so. One thing I will mention for the listeners is that on May 18, there was a call for a general strike, and I believe in Lebanon as well, people went out and protested. I've seen videos. It was beautiful. All around the world, there were protests in solidarity with a general strike across historic Palestine. That has never happened before. That all Palestinians and all Palestine standing together and deciding today we are not working. We're going to the street. We're going to chant. We're going to call for our freedom. Why is it significant? Because 50% of the construction industry and 50% of the pharmacy industry in Site 48, controlled by Israel, are Palestinian workers. So when more than 60,000 Palestinian workers in the construction industry went on strike on Tuesday and joined other Palestinians in protest, the industry in Israel lost millions of dollars. So we saw that as one example. Now imagine if we continue this momentum, go on strike every day in Palestine, they will lose so much money. They depend on Palestinians for their own daily lives, the functioning of their own daily lives. We will exert so much pressure on them that we'll probably achieve something eventually. So this is why it is different, because of the unity, because Palestinians who are leftist and who are on different points of the political spectrum didn't care and just came together and said, you know what, we're going to stand together and we're going to try to fight the occupation as one rather than as a divided people.
And this is also very significant from my perspective, because for once the agency was really in the hands of Palestinians. When we look at the previous, I don't know, at least the last 2 decades since I've been aware of what's happening in Palestine, I've seen more and more this kind of direction we're going into, where Palestinians are less and less powerful or have less and less leverage or agency in the conflict that's really just their own. Obviously, it's a conflict where a lot of people are invested in one way or another, but it's a Palestinian liberation struggle at the end, and still it didn't seem that Palestinians as a collective, as a community or as a society, basically, had strong political agency in fighting occupation, especially after being so fragmented with different interests as well. A lot of Palestinians rely on Israeli companies, on Israeli, employment for their livelihoods. I once heard someone, or read a tweet actually, someone saying, the only reason Israel doesn't kill all Palestinians, especially all Palestinian young men who might be a threat to it, is that, Israel needs their labor. And this is a very, interesting thing that no one really talks about, which is how Israel not only excludes and fragments Palestinian society, but also maintains a certain poor young section of this population to be always exploiting for profit. But what I wanted to kind of ask you, did you feel this time that whatever foreign governments would say, it's kind of the Palestinians' time? Was this just and this was my perspective, that this agency kind of came back to the Palestinians? Was this also yours?
Yes. So in America, at least, what happened was we saw some representatives leading letters to the State Department, and we saw them speak on the House floor and for the first time call Israel an apartheid state. I don't think that has ever happened on the House floor in Congress in the U.S. The fact that Representative Pocan, Representative Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, Mary Newman, etc., went out publicly in support of Palestinians and leading one of the bills that is trying to halt the sale of weapons, more than $735 million of weapons to Israel by the Biden administration, they cannot go back from that. So even if the attention on this dies down internationally, it is on the record that these representatives who have power have came out in support of Palestine without using any Israeli talking points of saying, oh, we believe in this, but also this, but rather they just went straight ahead. This is an apartheid state. Apartheid states aren't democracies, etc., etc., etc. So I am really looking forward to see what happens next, at least in the United States, when politicians have come out like that. The other thing is, I do hope that the momentum does not die down at all. You mentioned that they do depend on Palestinian labor. If people are interested, if some people listening here are readers, there's a book in Arabic, English, and Italian as well by Ibtisam Barakat. She is a Palestinian novelist. It's called Sifritifa, or The Book of Disappearance. And it's basically a fictional story about Palestinians disappearing from Palestine all of a sudden. And any Palestinian refugee who's trying to cross the border immediately vanishes. And how the Israeli society loses its mind, realizing that they cannot function without Palestinians. How they thought it was a strike in the beginning and then realized that it's just a strange occurrence. As if the land has taken back its people, as if it had absorbed them. I remembered this book when the strike happened because I realized I was reading fiction and the fiction had so much impact on the fictional Israeli community that lost its mind and couldn't function anymore because of the disappearance of Palestinians. And we did this in one day. Let's keep moving. Let's keep doing it.
I've got a dumb question, but it's a question that I think some people who maybe aren't so familiar with the issue might have, if you don't mind. And that is, you spoke earlier about Palestine liberation, and you're talking about keeping up the momentum. What is this working towards? What do you think? First off, is there agreement amongst Palestinians what this looks like in the like overall long term? And secondly, what do you think? What are the sort of like first steps, achievable gains that now that, a month ago didn't seem possible, but now seem possible?
Or even
That
end goal, or even end
yeah.
goal, because this kind of brought back the question of, is the two-state solution even a thing anymore? Is it,
Exactly.
which a lot of people are asking, it's a very valid question inside and outside Palestine within all of these
Exactly.
communities that we're talking about.
I hear that question. It's an important question. You're trying to entrap me as well. But um,
No, I
let
mean,
me,
this
yeah,
is,
no, I
there's a
I
lot of
agree.
diversity already on this question, so
Yeah,
it's
I
whatever
agree
you
with you.
say.
So, because this unity happened all of a sudden, I really don't know how to answer what the end goal is in terms of like official conversations, etc. Because I don't know if people sat down and talked about this. What I do know, however, is that we are all demanding for one thing. The liberation of Palestine includes the boycott, divestment, and sanction of all Israeli products, of Israeli academia, of Israeli cultural events, of Israeli, well, whatever you want. That is something that we have sort of put front and center as something that we are calling for when it includes the liberation of Palestine, to put pressure on Israel. The other thing we are also calling for is Palestinian rights, just basic human rights for Palestinians who live in 48, who are treated like second-class citizens, who are spat at, whose businesses are being destroyed, whose homes are being invaded. Palestinian rights for those in Jerusalem. Stop the expulsion of Palestinians in Jerusalem. Stop expanding illegal settlements into the West Bank. And then in Gaza, lift the blockade. Like we're starting with these tangible asks of things that are currently impacting the lives of Palestinians in historic Palestine. Push these aside. Treat Israel the same way you are treating Venezuela and Syria and Cuba and North Korea and all these countries that you're saying that they're abusing human rights, and you're putting sanctions on them. Why is Israel the exception? Sanction Israel, lift the blockade, stop the expulsion, stop settlement expansions, give equal rights to Palestinians. When that takes place, when we are no longer thinking about our survival, whether we're going to die today, whether we're going to be attacked today, that we can sit down and have a conversation within ourselves, organized within ourselves, and figure out, okay, what is the next step now? We can take a small breather now that the world is giving us some justice back. That's what I think. That's what I think. I personally
Yeah.
believe in these little asks first. And I don't think they're little, but these asks first.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really a very sensitive topic, because when you say, grant Palestinians equal rights, you're already, in a way, addressing the Israeli authorities, right? Because Israeli authorities are the ones discriminating, and Israeli society, obviously, it's not only the laws and policies, but it's Israel that's discriminating against Palestinians. So if Israel is to grant Palestinians equal rights, to me, it sounds like this contradicts the original Arab يعني I say Arab because we're used to it as Arabs in general, but original Palestinian revolution discourse, which says we need to liberate Palestine from river to sea. And I'm not like making any normative claims here. I'm just saying that let's move to Lebanon for a second, okay? So this is happening in Palestine. What did we see in Lebanon? We saw some reactions. Mostly, the best reactions are solidarity. Mostly solidarity. This was what we overwhelmingly saw in the last week or two. Many marches. There were two marches happening with 2 days apart, and each of them had over 1,000 people or something. It was really nice. To see this. At the same time, it's very unclear to most people around me, just my friends, people who discuss politics with me, I'll always ask me, what are we hoping for in Palestine? And There's a political group, the new political party in Lebanon called Citizens in a State, which released a statement saying, the solution for Palestine is one civil state in all over historic Palestine. And it had a lot of backlash because it's exactly the same discourse they used for Lebanon. It seemed like they were projecting, and they were very comfortable telling Palestinians what to do, whereby they would never do that to Syrians or any other Arab population. There was a lot of backlash, but the main point is that they put on the table this question of, what is the Palestinian political project? And I'm not trying to be here like putting you in like pressuring or anything about like the fact that Palestinians don't have a common political project. In my opinion, the history, like things that happened in the last 30, 40 years or 70 years even, made sure that Palestinians cannot remain one political society. And it's not the fault of Palestinians at all, in my opinion. But what I'm asking is, do you think we need this one common political project across the different areas of historic Palestine in order for the solidarity and for foreign policy of other governments to be more productive or more effective?
Thank you, Nizat. Just to be clear first, I do not recognize the state of Israel. A free Palestine to me is a free Palestine from the river to the sea. When I talk about the rights of Palestinians, I talk about it from the perspective of the international community. Israel is an occupying state under the Geneva Convention. It is required to provide rights, basic rights, to the people it occupies. Right now, Israel denies them basic rights. It oppresses them systematically. It has a military that terrorizes them and subjects Palestinians to racist laws just because they're Palestinian. So when I say provide Palestinians with their equal rights, I mean basic rights as an occupying power under international law. So that's one. The other thing is, a lot of people do ask about division in Palestinian society, but I think what we saw on Tuesday is proof that we can come together for the benefit of our land and our people. And I know that maybe you're thinking about the Palestinian Authority and the parties that exist in Palestine. The Palestinian Authority in itself is corrupt. Nobody's saying we're going to follow the Palestinian Authority with what they want. They're corrupt. Mahmoud Abbas has been president for 15, 16 years. He represents a very irrational leadership that is honestly shameful for us to be represented by someone who is embarrassing on the international sphere. From one hand. From the other hand, their corruption is so deep that they are still, the Gaza airport doesn't exist anymore. But money still goes to Gaza airport workers, which don't work, which don't exist. Like that whole institution does not exist. So where's the money going? To the other extent, in Bangladesh, the embassy of the Palestinian Authority is asking for donations, taking advantage of the situation in Gaza and asking for donations to the embassy, which we all know is not going to go to Gaza because the PA doesn't even have access to Gaza because of the blockade. For me, liberation is a liberation of the people, and the people have to do the work, and they are doing the work. And because the people is united, our fight is people against occupier. Occupied against occupier. I know there's a lot of politics that go in Palestine with all the divisions, but I really think we need to look at this moment, what has been happening for the past few weeks, as a moment of hope, showing Palestinians in the diaspora and refugee camps and inside Palestine just come as one and not argue about what should or shouldn't be done. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, Laura, I was asking this because we witnessed a Lebanese uprising a year and a half ago. And the moment itself was absolutely fascinating, how people came together from across the country, across sectarian lines, across political affiliations. They denounced the whole political establishment in Lebanon. There was class anger that we didn't see before against the ruling, financial elite. There was all sorts of things that, brought so much hope and euphoria to the people in Lebanon, including myself. And a few months later, with the lower momentum, the question became more and more about the politics and less about the moment itself. And maybe from this background is where I'm asking my question, because at some point people gotta say, okay, so we need to have a common agenda. And I think you outlined a very solid common agenda, which is to resist occupation and demand and force Israel to be at least the occupying power that it should be under international law. This is a very solid short-term agenda. But I think in terms of political imagination and political agenda in general, this big question, the elephant in the room, which is what do Palestinians want, and this is what I was trying to basically ask about.
Thank you, Nizar. I'm not going to pretend to know. I really don't know. I honestly don't know. Beyond the asks I provided, the liberation of Palestine, lifting the blockade, stopping the expulsion, sort of trying to protect the people that are currently under stress and under attack. That is something that I, as Laura, is sort of, moving towards. What comes next, I don't know.
Yeah, and it's just making a general comment here. People say it's a very complicated conflict. I don't think so. Maybe the solution, maybe the liberation itself and how it will happen is something that we can't clearly imagine now, but it's doable. Be it a one-state solution or a two-state solution, nothing is impossible at all. There are policies that can be enacted. There are changes in government and constitution and social structures that can happen much quicker than they have been happening in the past few decades. So, I'm not trying to kind of play the pessimistic role here at all. It's just that whatever the political agenda is, I think from now on, I'm more hopeful than ever that it can be achieved.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that you make about just, complicated things can actually be simpler than you think, both in the future and in the past, and one of the, at least from my perspective, I see a lot of people around the world, and especially in the United States where I'm from, they don't really know what's going on. And a lot of them don't really want to get involved because they don't really know too much. And then they're told it's really, really complicated. That is the narrative. But really, it does boil down to something quite simple, right? We're talking about a decades-long project to ethnically cleanse Palestine.
Yeah.
And there's a whole lot of detail, a whole lot of granularity in that. But if you, boil it all down, it can be explained very, very simply, and it comes down to this simple fact. And once people start to understand that, then you can start seeing, hopefully, a bit more change and more support, globally. Speaking of this and just the ethnic cleansing aspect of this, you spoke earlier, Laura, about the Nakba and the Naksa in '67, and these things, we have evidence right here in Lebanon of that, and those are our neighbors in the camps and in other locations. Palestinian refugees, somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 of them, living proof that this has happened. And they're still here. They're still waiting for justice.
And they still don't get any rights. I mean,
and they don't. Yeah, they don't.
Let's just talk about that for a second. Actually, for me, my romantic partner is a Palestinian refugee. She's a third-generation Palestinian refugee. Her grandparents were kicked out of Palestine in '48. They came to Lebanon. Her parents were born here. She was obviously born here. And still, as a Palestinian refugee, she's excluded from tons of occupations. She has many restrictions on even getting the Lebanese nationality. Even if she marries someone who's Lebanese, which is, Lebanese nationality, the Lebanese passport isn't the best gift you can get, to say the least. And still, they make it harder. They force Palestinian women to have kids, Lebanese kids, before they can get the nationality. Everything is harder. Literally everything you want to do on your personal life, career life, owning a house, forget it. Owning land, etc. Even land that is inherited from parents sometimes gets confiscated by these Waqf people. It's just like humiliation of a whole community of people that's happening in Lebanon since before the civil war. And instead of fixing it, what we see now, this is in terms of discourse from many political groups, is the same old discourse about Palestinian camps being, fertile grounds for terror and whatever, areas outside of state control, etc. Instead of being honest and ethical and saying, how are we forcing people to be living in such bad conditions without infrastructure, etc., and excluding them from society and restricting so many of their civil rights? So I think we have to go a long way. And I'm just gonna, one negative shout out here to Qatar, because Kataib Party is trying to reposition itself, as I was saying, as an opposition, as an anti-establishment movement in Lebanon. You know what the reaction to Palestine, to everything we're talking about was? The first few days, nothing, really. No mention of Palestine, no solidarity statement, nothing. And then Kataib releases a statement because one or two rockets were fired from, there were reports that they were fired from a Palestinian camp, and they were like, oh my God, Palestinian camps and the weapons and the Palestinian militias and I don't know what, and nothing on Palestine. And then when the backlash happened against them, Sami Jmail calls up Mahmoud Abbas, of all people, who, even in Lebanon, people realize Mahmoud Abbas doesn't represent Palestinians at all anymore, as Laura was saying earlier. He called Mahmoud Abbas up and said, yeah, we are supportive of the two-state solution and of the Palestinian statehood, etc., which is, like literally the worst thing you can do. And they did all of them. So this is just, a little critique to parties because, from now on, people in Lebanon are much more serious about new political parties and movements that try to kind of claim to be part of the Thawra or the uprising, etc. And you gotta change your political paradigm to be able to do that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm curious though, Laura. Before we wrap everything up, though, for people in Lebanon specifically, and Nizar just talked about some of the issues that Palestinians here face, as well as the reactions from certain political parties that are pretending to be new and progressive and everything. But what can people in Lebanon do, and Lebanese diaspora around the world on this issue to help bring about greater justice?
So there's a couple of things. Actually, Nidar, thank you for giving that explanation about Kataib. When I saw that, I thought, oh my God, infisam, like what's going on? make a decision. It was hilarious to me. But when it comes to what Lebanese people can do, whether in Lebanon or the diaspora, there's a lot to be done. Call out normalization when you see it. If you are in the diaspora and you have another passport, you're a dual citizen in any of the countries like UK, US, Canada, call your representatives. Call them and tell them, hi, I am a constituent of your district. I want you to halt weapons to Israel. I want you to call out the Israeli occupation, the killing of children, etc. We have so much power as just if you have a dual citizen in these countries. The other thing you can do as well is, keep up the online momentum. The reason why we are seeing what we are seeing in the region, the reason why Instagram and Facebook are trying to censor us and block any hashtags related to Palestine is because people keep tweeting about it. They keep posting about it. They keep resharing what people in Palestine are seeing. So do that if that is the minimal thing you can do. And the last thing I would recommend is, if you are capable to go beyond online and join organizations on the ground who are organizing to either protest or defend the rights of Palestinians in Lebanon, for example, then do that. There are so many organizations in Lebanon that are trying to do that, and I think they need a lot of help and resources, and it would be helpful to start there if that is something you're capable to do. You mentioned refugees in Lebanon. And it's not enough they were expelled and shot at as they were fleeing their homes in Palestine to also be treated with the humiliation like this in Lebanon or other countries in the region, where you have to sort of keep your head down if you're a Palestinian, because you're going to be scared if they're going to kick you out or they're going to attack your family or if something's going to happen to you. It's not fair. It's really not fair. My family, they fled Yafa, Haifa, Akka. And I remember a story from my great-grandfather who was carrying one of my aunts on his back as he was running from his home, and they went to Syria on foot. And my aunt had disabilities, so they were shooting at them, and she got injured. She got hit, actually, and she fell to the ground, and they had to keep running. They had to leave her behind and keep running because they were going to die. And they were all mourning the death of my aunt, and my great-grandfather came back to pick up my aunt's body so that they can bury her with them wherever they resettle in Syria or in Lebanon. And he comes back and he sees her sitting amongst dead Palestinians in Yafa. And she was a child. She was maybe 12 years old at the time. And she was laughing and smiling and telling him, Baba, Baba, you came. And that is heartbreaking. That is heartbreaking, noting that the Israeli occupation isn't just attacking who we are as Palestinians. They are attacking our future. They are attacking our children. They have complete disregard to our humanity. And that is something everyone around the world should fight. And one last thing I would emphasize, the Palestinian people are not free until everyone on this earth is free. And that includes Black people and migrants and indigenous people and brown people. And even in Lebanon, the people who are oppressed, they're not giving their rights from all backgrounds, from all communities. We are in this as a joint struggle. We are not fighting alone. And we really do appreciate all the solidarity that the people in Lebanon have shown the Palestinians.
Well, with this beautiful note, first of all, I want to thank you so much, Laura, for joining us on this episode. It was really informative and really inspiring.
Yeah, no, this was a really good discussion. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all of the information. I learned a whole lot today. So yeah, I hope we'll be able to maybe do a little bit more coverage of Palestine in the future as well, because it is such an important topic, and we're tied to it geographically. Lebanon and Palestine are tied at the hip, or joined at the hip. So hopefully we'll be coming back to it as well. Thank you so much, Laura, for coming on the program.
Thank you so much, Nizar and Ben. I really appreciate your time today.
All right. Well, that's it for us this week. We will be back next week with another episode. Until then, I'm Benjamin Red.
I'm Nizar Hassan.
I'm Laura Albast.
And this has been the Lebanese Politics Podcast.
Lebanese Politics Podcast is brought to you by myself, Nizar Hassan, Benjamin Red, produced behind the scenes by Susan Wilson, and the music is by Omar El Fil.